of Anita M. Weiss's book, Interpreting Islam, Modernity and Women's Rights in Pakistan. Please switch off your mobile phones or put them on silence mode. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the discussion. We would appreciate if complete silence is observed while the session is in progress. Our moderator for this session is Nausheen Ahmed. Nausheen Ahmed is a barrister and is actively involved in Shirkatgah and conducts research on gender issues. Nausheen, over to you.
Thank you so much. Just once more, if you would all kindly ensure that your mobile phones are on silence. Welcome everybody to this session. It's really wonderful to see so many people here, and especially to see so many young people here. Dr. Anita Weiss is, I'm sorry.
You can take that off.
Yeah, maybe I should. Yeah. Dr. Anita Weiss is an American scholar who received her doctorate in sociology from UC Berkeley. She is presently professor of international studies at the University of Oregon, USA. She's published extensively. In fact, when I went to get her book in Islamabad at Said Book Bank, he gave me a stack of books and he said, "Which one do you want?" Her new book project is Countering Violent Extremism in Pakistan, Local Actions, Local Voices. And Dr. Weiss, I think that, listening to various panels here at the festival and discussions, I think that's a book that will be eagerly awaited and anticipated. Retired Justice Nasra Iqbal needs no introduction. She's an eminent lawyer, somebody who works on human rights in Pakistan, and she's already said it, so I'm not going to introduce her with reference to the poet Iqbal, because she said that she does not, she's not a takedar for him, just the same way as Maulvis are not takedars for Islam. That really resonated with me, and I'm repeating that. So to start off with, Dr. Weiss, why did you write this book?
Assalamu alaikum. I'd like to, is this on? Is that on? I'd like to invite anybody standing there. You can just kind of fill up the steps now here. You can come here. Just, it's
You can even come on the stage now because
the younger
Nasra
people
Iqbal is sitting down.
People who don't mind sitting on the floor and have the capacity to stand up from the floor again. Some of you know what I mean. You're welcome to fill this in. I guess we got the small room.
Kamran, there's a space there in the corner.
Okay, so I'll begin because we only have a half hour. So what really inspired me to write this book? First, let me tell you that the first word... It's not working? Hello? Is that better?
Do you want this?
No, it's okay. It's easier if I can use the automatic thing. The first word of the book, the first sentence is ijtihad, interpretation. Because for so many years, I've been coming to Pakistan now for 39 years. I've done a lot of research in Pakistan. Mujhe Urdu bahut achhi tarah aati hai. But to talk about my book, with your graciousness, I'd prefer to speak in English for a bit. And then I can answer in Urdu perhaps, maybe. So much poetry here, I feel so inadequate with my Urdu now. But anyhow, khair. So, but in all these years I've been coming to Pakistan, people have said to me, we can't do this because of Islam. We must do this because of Islam. Islam does not affect what we do whatsoever. So, as I wrote at the outset, in the many years I've been conducting research on women's rights in Pakistan and in other parts of the Muslim world, this one term of ijtihad seems to rise to the top whenever I question how someone has reached the conclusion that they have about women's rights, especially in modern times. In other words, my key concerns and arguments in this book is that different Muslim communities are interpreting, in this case within Pakistan, but it does have generalizable significance to other parts of the Muslim world. They're interpreting the intersections of Islam and modernity and where women's roles and rights fit into that equation. I begin with a discussion of the theological and historical notion of ijtihad and how that manifests today. And then I provide a framework considering women's rights in global contexts. I don't know how you all feel, and if there are members of the press here, I would prefer for you not to quote me on the next sentence. But I just don't know how Fazlullah, who has no background, no education, Fazlullah initially of the SWAT Taliban, now leader of the Taliban, how he says he can conduct ijtihad. That's not what ijtihad had been historically, but people are not questioning that. So now you can quote me again from now on.
So your book, I mean, I read it from cover to cover because even though it's a scholarly work, it's actually incredibly readable, and I would advise everybody here to get a copy and read it. And it has a very interesting juxtaposition between what the chapter that you call Progressive Women's NGOs and their interpretation of women's rights, and then the orthodox Islamist interpretations. And it almost seems from the way that your chapters are structured that, you know, that there is that inherent conflict between the two. I'd like you to talk about that.
Certainly. And first I should mention that they've kindly put some books there that are for sale. Syed, I did have everything I've written, I've made sure has been republished in either Pakistan or India for South Asia. This has been republished by Orient Black Swan in India, and Syed Book Bank imports it into Pakistan, and apparently Liberty Books in Karachi is selling it. So, interesting. I'm a sociologist. I think of typologies and categories a lot. And so the way that the progressive women's movements construct an image of women's rights and where Islam fits in, they're very different within each other as well. I use the two case studies in that chapter of Shirkat Gah and the Audit Foundation, and they both have different visions of the role played. The Audit Foundation has actually reached out to ulama in Pakistan to talk about their programs, to see how ulama think about their programs and suggestions for them. While Shirkat Gah, very, very policy-oriented, very goal-oriented, doing a lot more research, Audit Foundation is very applied, project-oriented. But what I found is that while they share many similarities, that's why I use these two case studies of the best known, biggest, oldest women's, and I mean not the oldest, not the one that was founded in Karachi by Begum Liaquat Ali Khan, but that's different. So anyhow, old friend just walked in. Anyhow, but so what I was looking at though is not only how they perceive women's rights, but also the differences with them. So too, you could make that same argument for when I talked about the orthodox Islamist groups in Pakistan. For that, I use the case studies of the Jamaat-e-Islam, and I especially emphasize their social welfare activities, not their political activities. Secondly, I looked at the social reform agenda of the Muttahida Majlis-e-Amal government that was in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa 2003 to 2008. And then finally, I looked at Al-Huda. And what you find in each of these, that in very different ways, they try to rely on different Quranic verses, different tafsir, to try to understand what Islam says about the role of women in society. But they differ dramatically from each other. And what Al-Huda says is nothing at all what the Jamaat says. And then, if I may take it one step further, the other substantive case study chapter was that of the SWAT Taliban, which is the biggest outlier of them all. And trying, based on interviews I conducted in SWAT over between 2010 and 2012 with over 125 women in SWAT. And also reading up as much as I could about in Zama SWAT, the online SWAT newspaper, and in many other places, I tried to put together what the SWAT Taliban's image of women's rights are too. What they say based on Islam, but so completely different from what I called the Orthodox Islamist movements.
Thank you, Anita. That's really interesting. I turn to Nasra Iqbal and talk to you putting on your women's rights activism hat for a moment. And I just want to ask you, as Dr. Weiss has mentioned, there is so many different interpretations of Islam. And as you know, within the women's rights, we have been having this debate and we have this argument more and more whether we can actually approach women's rights on the basis of Islam or whether we should just simply continue to talk about a secular approach. And because I do work with Shirkat Gah, and as Dr. Weiss has pointed out, we tend to move more with the secular approach. But what is your view?
Thank you very much, Nosheen. First of all, I'm very grateful to OUP. I thought it was working.
Yeah.
It is. I'm grateful to OUP to have included me in today's event because it gave me an opportunity to read Anita Weiss's book from cover to cover. And I read it very slowly to savor the entire flavor of what she has written. And I must appreciate that it's a very well-researched and well-organized book. And in the last chapter, she tells us about moving forward. I feel embarrassed that we are all here, many of us part of the women's movement, human rights activists. I don't know why. We have not been able to write a book so much in depth in the manner that this book has been written. And the organization is remarkable. First of all, the introduction of Ijtihad and then going on to what the modernist views are and then the conservative views. And the SWAT Taliban is a gruesome chapter. It really frightens me. But all said and done, what I would like to point out is that, of course, just as we had in Aisha Jalal's session now, Pakistan was created as a homeland for the Muslims, and it was not an Islamic state. It was not created as an Islamic state. This was something which was sort of imposed on us by Mr. Zia. And since then, we've had to live with it because when the 18th Amendment took place, the women's movement, I wrote from the women's movement to Mr. Raza Rabbani that he should take the Constitution back to 73, repeal everything else, so that we have a clean slate to work with, and there would not have been the fear of how we remove those portions which are damaging to women's rights, but it was not done. And I do believe that we should take up what Anita Weiss has said in her final chapter about moving forward, when we do research as well as we try to work out women's rights within the framework of Pakistan. Now, Ijtihad, as we all know, and as Anita has analyzed it in her first chapter, it was a word which was used very intensely by Iqbal in his Reconstruction lectures, and he said Ittihad is the principle of movement in the social structure of Islam, and we cannot say that modernization is westernization. It is just the recognition of the element of change or the factor of change, and that, as you have very rightly pointed out, is the only way that we can move forward. And of course, we have a problem that at this moment, you rightly said, this government is a conservative government. And then, of course, we have this nuisance of Al-Huda, which so many women have got involved with. It's become a global movement. And you didn't mention it in your book, but I'd like to share that what happened in Florida was a direct result of an Al-Huda inspiration, that woman. And she brainwashed her husband, and they attacked the people there, all in the name of, I don't think it was Islam, but that's in the name of Al-Huda. So it was California, old age. So I do feel that we should beware as the women's movement is very well represented over here. And we see that the Council of Islamic Ideology, that is another thing that she has discussed in depth. We had a very progressive chairman, and he in fact he released the report on the Muslim Family Laws Ordinance 1961, but it was done, as she said, in 2004. Because people just sat on it. They felt, a little bit afraid. Everybody is afraid, but what is there to be afraid of? And I leave you to say what you'd like to.
No, I want you to continue, but he released it in about 2004, 2005. The report was actually finished in 1986, during the time of Zia, and they absolutely refused to release it.
Yes, that was
Because
of
it
the
said
fear.
there's nothing, the Council of Islamic Ideology said there's nothing in the Muslim Family Laws Ordinance that contradicts Islam.
And then you have rightly pointed out, the major legislation pro-women was done in the times of Musharraf, towards the end of his reign, and then by Zardari, towards the end of his elected term. And the reason, as we discussed yesterday, was mainly because they wanted to win the women's vote. It was all cosmetic. What Musharraf did particularly was to wipe out what he said when he went to the United States, that women get raped in Pakistan to get visas and to get money. And he was referring to Mukhtar Mai, and I think that was the most insensitive thing that anybody could ever have said. And after that, he went into the spate of women's, pro-women's legislation, but they're all meaningless, just cosmetic. So we have to have some meaningful legislation. And I would very strongly urge everyone to read Anita Wise's book and the last chapter, which is about moving onwards, because it has to be substantive change. And Islam doesn't prohibit any substantive change. 75% of the legislative verses in the Quran concern the family and women. And that shows that family law is at the heart of the Sharia. And it's something progressive. And also, we have the Siyasa Sharia power of the state. That means that the state can interpret the basic outline injunctions which are given in a manner which is meant for the greater benefit of the greater number. And half of us in Pakistan and worldwide are women, and more than 1.5 billion of the world's population are Muslim women. So we should get together and do something positive about this. Thanks to you, Anita.
Thank you so much. There's a chapter in this book, and you referred to Nawaz Sharif's government also, and I think it is a conservative government, and it's also a government that is now currently attacking liberal, non-profit organizations as well. There's a chapter in this book on CEDAW. And it's very interesting because Dr. Weiss has traced Pakistan's ratification of CEDAW and then the various setbacks suffered. And she said here, and I'm just reading very quickly from this, in conclusion, is that the main impediment to promoting women's rights in Pakistan is the state's ambivalence to do so. And I'd like to ask you, why is the state ambivalent? And you've pointed out many instances there. And would you like to comment on that?
Certainly. And thank you both for wonderful comments and questions. Actually, the section on CEDAW it's a separate section when I'm talking about the history of state policy towards women. So it's a very long chapter that's going into why Ayub Khan created the Muslim Family Laws Ordinance and then the whole history of what happened during Zardari Zia, Zardari, and Zia, Musharraf, and Zardari. So about the state's ambivalence. In this day and age, why would a state be ambivalent about the roles and rights of women in their country? Every state, so many times we've heard the state of Pakistan, whether it's the prime minister, the president, or other people who are part of the state apparatus, say we must bring our women along. If you haven't heard that quote of Bacha Khan's, and I don't want to get it wrong here, but he said that you can always tell the character of a country by its treatment of women. And ever since then, in Pakistan, people say we must bring women along. It was Jinnah who also came out and said that, you know, in Pakistan, it's not, I don't remember the quote, but it's not our intent to leave women behind. Why is the state so ambiguous today? Well, what I talk about in the concluding chapter are the culture wars that are ripping Pakistan apart. Because Pakistanis are not in agreement with each other about things. I just came from Charsadda, and I have a Pakistan origin card, so I can go. Most Americans cannot. But I was in Charsadda, Mardan, and Peshawar. And I was hearing a cacophony of different voices talking about what is happening in Pakistan. And I'm sure that those voices were very different from what I'm hearing here in Karachi. But the state's ambivalence has to do with these culture wars, has to do with people's ideas of what Pakistan should be. And they're willing to fight and kill for what this image of Pakistan is, but that's not the image that other people hold necessarily. And what Pakistan truly needs, I believe, is a strong state that will be a mediator about these culture wars, a state that will actually come out and assert certain things, a state that will change who the current head of the Council of Islamic Ideology is, who would come out and say, it's okay, in the Quran it's allowed to slap your wife. You know what? The Quran Sharif talks about life in another era, and it talks about life in another age. I'm not going to try to, I don't have the scholarly background either to conduct ijtihad about what is meant on this. But I can guarantee that in this day and age of so much violence against women, so much domestic violence, but also the effort to bring women into the labor force, to bring women into the political process, to bring women like Amina Syed into being a leader of society, the social aspects of life. That to say it's okay for a husband to slap his wife is, you know, and this is somebody who represents the state as the head of the current head of the Council of Islamic Ideology, whose term was just renewed. That's not the state taking a leadership role to mediate these culture wars.
Thank you. And that was a very strong and passionate statement, and we all needed to hear that. I'll open it up for questions now.
Oh yeah, Salman.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi. So Anita, congratulations on the book and all the research that you've been doing. You know, you're going back and forth. So first an observation and then a question. I recently saw this film by Martin Scorsese called Silence. And I use that as an illustration where the Christian missionaries are trying to sort of impose or dawat, they're inviting Japanese to accept Christianity. And what happens in the end, it's a very long and quite sad film, but the thing is the soil ready to accept a new ideology? That's what the question was. So in Pakistan, related to your research on women, 3 snapshots of 3 generations of women. First one, Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah's sister, Fatma Jinnah, who was his confidant, chief strategist, very powerful woman, social activist, made a huge impact. Next generation, Benazir Bhutto became prime minister, very powerful woman, accepted by the masses. And then recently, the current generation, Malala Yousafzai, from the region that you're talking about, where you did the research, stood up to the Taliban, spoke openly against them. So do you see the soil of Pakistan conducive for women's empowerment?
Thank you. Well, let me take his. I'll take Salman's question because he's behind me, and then I'll take the other questions. I think that the soil of Pakistan has to be ready to do this because these culture wars are being fought constantly. I call them culture wars, but they are physical manifestations of violence. That violence often takes place over the lives of women. And so, you know, will Pakistan ever theoretically be ready? Who knows? But it has to practically and pragmatically, something has to be done now because we need to have a consensus. And frankly, only the state has the ability to create that consensus. We no longer have the poet Iqbal who can step in and say, let's find some consensus. But it has, I mean, there has to be that. Look at all the women at the Karachi Literature Festival. Nobody ever said these women should stay inside of Chadar or Chardawari. And nobody ever said you should not be educated. But there are many women who would never come here because they don't even know about it, because they're not educated, and they are in Chadar or Chardawari. So what is Pakistan? I would love to see some type of national discussion, national consensus, but it really is something that the state has to be behind.
I think if we only have time to maybe take 2 questions, so one here and one at the back. Yeah.
And then one guy.
Do we give them a
And then there's a guy
The
there.
2 ladies here, one here
And
and then one at the back.
and then this one man. We should have a man's question.
You,
I'll take
you've
all
talk-
3
you-
questions at once.
You've talked about women's rights in here, I'm here. You've talked about women's right in the global context. And of course, everything affects Pakistan and Pakistan affects other things. I want to know what your views are about the potential threat to women's rights in the USA now that they have a president who said it was okay to grab women by the fanny. With respect to everybody.
There's another question there at the back.
And then for gender parity, we have a man over here with a question.
We always talk about better legislation and legislation for women's rights, but do you think that's enough given a lot of women don't have education? So how do we go about implementing that legislation and moving towards an ideological change?
Okay, and there's a man,
Gentleman here.
the gentleman over there for gender parity. Want to hear from...
Thank you very much. Ma'am, in the beginning of your talk, you were talking about different groups of people who had different interpretation of Quranic verses. So, when we talk about women rights in Pakistan, we have people belonging to different ethnical groups in Pakistan, in different provinces, and we have different social classes as well. And so, can we say that these interpretations are influenced by cultural conditioning and economics as well? The interpretation of different verses regarding the women's rights. Thank you very much.
Okay, combining them together, of course, the way that people practice and understand women's rights is a product of culture, it's a product of class, it's a product of education and many other things. But we have to remember that people from the same ethnic group, same class background, similar family backgrounds may also have a different understanding. They may want to send their daughter to school, they may want not to send their daughter to school, and they may want to send their single daughter abroad to study further. So we have a whole variety of different things. And I'm not saying that, I mean, people within their families need to have that discussion within the family. But it's when people from outside the family start to assert their opinion as to what your women should be doing is where we have actual real conflict. We have parliamentary conflict. We have violent conflict. Going back to your question.
About education.
Oh, about education. You know, we can say we can't wait for everybody to be educated because they're not getting educated because of some restrictions. But education itself in Pakistan becomes problematic at times. What are people actually be educated about? I just had the privilege of being able to visit 4 different Bacha Khan schools in Mingora, Dargai, Mardan, and Charsada. And the education at these co-ed schools that the children are receiving about women's rights is so fundamentally different from what they're getting at a government school or at a madrasa school, because that's really the alternative of where these children would be going to school. Education is important, but everybody in this country cares about women's rights. Even if what you're caring about it is, the women in my family will not go outside whatsoever. I mean, that's also your own caring about women's rights. But I'm talking about women in the public arena enforcing these laws that have been passed. I mean, the fact that the laws exist to begin with, I think, is a step in the right direction. But now they have to be enforced. Police have to know it. The judiciary and the lower courts have to know about those laws. I don't want to say anything about this man who somehow, he's not my president. Nope.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. There are so many questions, and I can see so many hands. And I'd request Dr. Weiss if you can just stay behind for a bit after this session and speak to everybody who wants to speak to you.
Is there another session in this
Yes.
room? Is there
So,
another session in here?
I think there is. Yes.
Okay,
there
well,
is.
I can walk outside, and if you want to if you purchase the book now, I'm happy to sign the book for you as well. So thank you.
Thank you,
And thank
everybody.
you for the honor
and
of talking to you about my work.
Thank you.
Thank you for attending this session. Our
We
next
have
session-
15 minutes. We can stay in this room. I've just been informed.
Okay, great.
You know, I didn't realize your connection with Shirkat Das, but I hope you like what I wrote about Shirkat Das. I mean, I know many people in the Horn of Islamabad.
Thank you for attending this session. Our next session is titled Book Launch of Hindustan Ki Mausiki.